Hello and welcome back. I'm Joseph Hoffman, and in this lesson, we're learning about the weird step cousins of the perfect fourth, the augmented and diminished fourths. They are much less common than their perfect relative, the perfect fourth, but they still have an important place in the music family. So let's get to know them and all their weirdness. We've already learned that the perfect fourth is very common in music. Let's look at the C major scale. Perfect fourths are hidden everywhere in a major scale. We've got a perfect fourth here. From A to D is also a perfect fourth. From B to E, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth, perfect fourth. There's only one place in the C major scale, using all the white keys, that gives us not a perfect fourth, and that's right here. Remember last time we looked at this interval and noticed it sounds kind of weird, A, and B, it's not 2 whole steps plus a half step. It's actually 3 whole steps apart, which makes it an augmented fourth. Notice it has that kind of bizarre sound. Imagine trying to play Here Comes the Bride with an augmented fourth. Here comes the bride. Maybe if you're getting married to a zombie, right? We want to hear this sound. That's the sound we want, that perfect fourth, but sometimes in music, we might want something a little different, a little spicy, and that's when we might use an augmented fourth. Remember how thirds come in 2 flavors? We have major thirds and we have minor thirds. Well, fourths come in 3 flavors. We have perfect, augmented, and diminished. The word augmented means to increase something. So when you augment something, you make it bigger, you grow it. In music, when you augment something, you grow it by 1/2 step. So let's take this perfect fourth here. If we wanted to make that an augmented fourth, we could take this F and grow it or augment it a 1/2 step. C to F sharp is called an augmented fourth. For diminished fourth, we want to shrink it by a 1/2 step. So let's take this C and F again. Well, I could move this F down to an F flat, or I could move this C up to a C sharp. C sharp to F is called a diminished fourth. We shrink it by a 1/2 step. So let's practice building some augmented and diminished fourths, starting with the augmented fourth. 2 ways you can augment it. Let's take this perfect fourth. It's always best to start with the perfect fourth, and then you can either augment it by raising the top note by a 1/2 step, and see that grows it further apart, or, so like this is an augmented fourth, or, let's go back to our perfect, you could take the bottom note and go down a 1/2 step, and also notice how that augments it by growing it. D flat to G is also an augmented fourth. Let's see if you can do one. Let's take this perfect fourth from A to D. Now, can you show me how to augment this by raising the top note a 1/2 step? Where would we move this to? If you're pointing right here, you're correct. A to D sharp would be an augmented fourth. Let's try another one. What if we had this perfect fourth from D flat to G flat? Where would be an augmented fourth above D flat? All you have to do is take this G flat and raise it a 1/2 step to G. D flat to G is an augmented fourth. Now let's create some augmented fourths by lowering the bottom note. Let's take this perfect fourth here. We have F to B flat. What would we do to this bottom note to make it an augmented fourth? Remember, to augment, we want to grow it. So we're going to take this bottom note and move it down a 1/2 step, which interestingly we would call F flat, not E. Why F flat? Well, that's so on the staff it still looks like a fourth. We want to still call it an F to B interval because those notes are a fourth apart. F to B, we flat the B and then we also flat the F to get that augmented fourth. If we called this an E, E to B flat would actually be a kind of fifth because the letters are 5 apart, E, F, G, A, B. The notes and the letters have to reflect the interval. That's why we would call this F flat to B flat if we want it to be an augmented fourth. Let's try one more. Let's say we wanted to find an augmented fourth below D. Well, let's start by finding a perfect fourth. It's always easiest to start with a perfect fourth. Where's a perfect fourth below D? Can you point on your screen? If you're pointing here, you're correct. Easy way to find it is half step plus whole step plus whole step. Half step, whole step gives us a perfect fourth, and then to augment it, we'll lower it one extra half step. D to A flat gives us an augmented fourth. Another way to find augmented fourth would just be do 3 whole steps in a row. Whole step, whole step, whole step will also always give you an augmented fourth. Now let's talk about diminished fourths. Diminished fourths are rare, even rarer and weirder than their cousin, the augmented fourth, but they do occur in a harmonic minor scale. Let's look at A harmonic minor. Because of that G sharp, let's say we wanted to keep going up, even past this note. Notice from G sharp to C is a diminished fourth. It's a half step plus a whole step plus a half step. Half step, whole step, half step. Notice G to C, there's our perfect fourth, here comes the bride. But if we sharp that G, we've moved it even closer together. G sharp to C makes a diminished fourth. 2 ways you can make a diminished fourth. You can either raise the lower note of a perfect fourth, or you can lower the top note. But beware, when you lower that top note, you might be tempted to say this is G to B. But remember, we need the letters to look like a fourth too. And so the letters also have to be G, A, B, C. We would have to call this a C flat to technically be a diminished fourth. Now wait, Mr. Hoffman, you might be saying to yourself, that interval looks like a major third, right? What if we were in the key of G? G to B, do, re, mi, is in fact a major third. Well, what this tells us is that a diminished fourth and a major third are enharmonic. Remember that in music theory, sometimes we can have 2 ways to spell the same note. If it seems a little confusing, just trust me on this one. There are music theory reasons which we'll get to know even better as we get to more advanced music and start to see these in context in the music you play. Let's practice creating some diminished fourths. Again, just like creating augmented fourths, start with the perfect and then shrink it. So let's say we had this perfect fourth right here from D to G. Can you show me how to make this diminished by changing the top note? Where would we go? Point on your screen. If we take this G and make it a G flat, remember, keep the letter the same. If we called this an F sharp, it wouldn't be a diminished, then it would be a major third. But if we flat the G, D to G flat, you can see on the staff, it looks like a fourth, and it is a fourth. It's just a diminished fourth. Now, what if we had this perfect fourth from A to D? If we wanted to change the top note to make this a diminished fourth, what would we do? Point on your screen. If you're pointing right here, you're correct. And what would we call this note? Would we call it C sharp or D flat? If you said D flat, you're correct. To make it a fourth, we need to keep the original letter name, keep the letters 4 apart, A, B, C, D, and then call it a D flat. Now, we can also make diminished fourths by raising the bottom note of a perfect fourth by a half step. So let's say we had C to F as our perfect fourth. Point on your screen to where I would need to go to make it a diminished fourth by changing the bottom note. If you're pointing right here, you're correct. And we would call that a C sharp to F to make it a diminished fourth. One more. If we were on a B, first let's find the perfect fourth. can you point to a perfect fourth above B? If you're pointing right here, you're correct. We need whole step, half step for a perfect fourth. Now let's make it diminished by changing the bottom note. Point on your screen where we would need to change this B to. We would go right here. And what would we call this? This is a tricky one. If you said B sharp, you're correct. Remember, it looks like a C, but enharmonically we want to spell it B sharp so it can still be a fourth. And that B sharp to E is a diminished fourth, which, yes, it looks just like a major third, C to E, but enharmonically, like let's say we're in the key of C sharp minor. If I'm in the key of C sharp minor, C is already sharped, and that's why sometimes a composer might prefer to call this B sharp, so we can keep C as a sharp note, and this can be the B sharp that leads to C sharp. We wouldn't want a C natural and a C sharp in the same melody, if possible. And that's why sometimes we'd call this B sharp to E. Again, if this seems a little confusing, trust me that it will make more sense over time. For now, just remember, an augmented fourth is a perfect fourth that you just increase or augment by one half step, by either moving the top note up a half step or the bottom note down a half step. That creates an augmented fourth. To create a diminished fourth, we want to shrink it. Like let's take D to G as our perfect fourth. We can flat the G or we can sharp the D to create a diminished fourth. Now let's play a little game to practice. I'm going to play an interval on the piano and I'd like you to identify it. Tell me if it's a perfect fourth or an augmented fourth or a diminished fourth. Here's your first one. D sharp to G. What is it? If you said diminished fourth, you are correct. D sharp to G is diminished. You could figure that out by noticing that the perfect fourth is D to G and we just shrunk it a little bit. Another way to tell that would be to notice half step, whole step, half step gives us a diminished fourth. Here's the next one. G to C sharp. What kind of interval is that? If you said augmented fourth, you're correct. Two ways to figure that out. You could have seen that G to C is a perfect fourth, and we just augmented that by a half step. Or you could have noticed whole step, whole step, whole step. 3 whole steps in a row makes an augmented fourth. Here's another one. D flat to G flat. What interval is that? If you said perfect fourth, you're correct. Maybe you noticed it by the sound, which is perfectly fine. Your ears could have said, I recognize that. Here comes the bride. Or whole step, half step is a good technique as well. One more. E flat to A. What do you hear? Or what do you see? If you said augmented fourth, you're correct. It's 3 whole steps apart. It has that weird sound, which maybe you've started to recognize. And that makes an augmented fourth. Great job learning about augmented and diminished fourths today. This is an important concept, which we'll come back to many times in the future. So to help you get even more practice, I encourage you to complete the theory worksheets for this lesson available from the Hoffman Academy website. Happy practicing, and see you next time.
Hey, Scuba! Agent Double Sharp! Sorry, Agent Double Sharp. I couldn't help but notice that your spirits seem very, well, diminished today. I am feeling diminished. No matter what I try, I can't crack this case. What case?
Your case! The case of your missing purple pen!
Oh, that pen? I found it days ago.
You did? Where?
It was under my bed. Silly me.
Under your bed? Of course.
What do you mean, of course?
Oh, my supercomputer in the Double Sharp cave told me that it had a high probability of being near a place that you regularly go.
I could have told you that.
Well, if you're so smart, then why don't you just find it yourself?
I did find it. Now my spirits are diminished.
I'd say your anger seems augmented.
That too. And I was just coming to cheer you up.
You were? I'm sorry. Now my double sharp mind is extremely curious what you're going to do to cheer me up.
Well, I might have a case for Agent Double Sharp.
A case?
Yes. Monkey said he had 3 bananas on his table last night, but when he woke up...
Let me guess. There were only 2.
No, that's the mysterious thing. The numbers of bananas didn't diminish. When he woke up, there were 4.
Aha! The case of the mysteriously augmenting bananas. And incidentally, these augmenting bananas have also augmented my spirits. Thank you, Princess. You're a great friend.
Aw.
Agent Double Sharp is on the case. Activate double speed. Dun, dun, dun.